We'll see how well this thing records. I don't know. Oh, well, okay. All right, so I guess people will come in. I know we're a minute early. So, all right, so while we're doing that, let's check the Qriket score. I need to share the screen. I know. And I'm on a different machine screen. Can you see that okay? Add this device. This is where I destroy everything by adding another device. Okay, that's good. That's my calendar. That's not exciting. It's like one of several calendars, which is the real problem. Okay, so what's happening is Pakistan and Australia are playing in the semi-final of the T20 because of this COVID thing. It is in, well, maybe it was supposed to be, but it's in United Arab Emirates, so it's being played in Dubai, which, if it doesn't make any sense, that's correct. But Pakistan is teeing off. They're doing well. We'll see how we go in this one. The good news is New Zealand beat England yesterday in an absolutely spectacular way, and they deserve to. All right, I have to check on that. It's nighttime over there. Okay, humans are here. All right, so I think if you need to say anything, just let me try and turn the. Any echoes? Are we recording? Is it coming through okay? Okay. All right. So, disease. Let's talk about infectious disease. Now, you will have come across this potentially in other courses. I'll give you the pox version, which is sort of a big overview, and then what we did historically. And you will see that what we've been presenting in pox for many, many years is relevant. This is the front page today of the Burlington Free Press. And where are we? Well, it's November 11th. It's Remembrance Day. For not a day that's really sad, but across the world, there's a minute of silence at 11 a.m. Okay. Yeah. So why is this happening? I mean, this is for Vermont, of course, and so the numbers are kind of going up. We'll check again next week, I think. But yeah.
So I have some thoughts about that.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know. We were talking last class, and I got really kind of tied into what you were talking about in the first 5 minutes, and kind of went on a whole different brain train.
Okay. Sorry.
No disrespect. Like, it was definitely like related to what you were talking about. I don't want it to sound like I was zoning out the whole class. Okay.
No.
We talk about how the numbers you like show at the beginning of several classes, like these COVID graphs that like make everyone freaked out, and like, which, it's a real thing. We study it. It's a, problem. But what I think we're lacking when we look at those charts of like increased numbers of COVID is also what are percentages for hospitalizations and ICU beds, and then also what percentage of those are unvaccinated individuals. Because
it should be broken out into unvaccinated and vaccinated, and I'm not sure why that hasn't been done. But I will say, if you look at the New York Times ones, for example, the hospitalizations are there. That is a crucial thing to look at, and of course, deaths.
And it's 70 to 85% in most every state, if you look at the current research, are unvaccinated individuals, and they don't have like solid research on like every single state yet, but you can look into those numbers as seeing 70 to 85% of those hospital beds that are taking up, that are being filled are unvaccinated individuals. And
so this is Vermont. Hospitalizations are here, tests and deaths, and they should lag a little bit. But yeah, go on. Yep.
And so what I've been thinking about is we talk about excess deaths and the number of excess deaths and the number of excess deaths rising, and a number of hospitalizations rising, and the number of unvaccinated individuals largely potentially causing this. And so what I was kind of going down on my brain train is like a scientific blame game. Like, how many of those excess deaths could we exactly relate back to those individuals that are unvaccinated? Because just in like, if you look at kind of Vermont news, you can see that 25 the lowest vaccinated counties account for 25% of today's case rates, and that's less than 10% of the state's population. So if you could spatially find those counties that have the lowest vaccination rates, how are they contributing to the number of excess deaths specifically? Can you break it out and say these individuals are thus causing this many deaths? And how many, like, could you break it down to that level? You know, you can't say like you're causing this many deaths, but you could,
That's
if you
problem.
look at the number of excess deaths and looking at the number of unvaccinated individuals, you could easily, I think, break it out into those levels. And then if we were able to do that and kind of play the scientific blame game, let's say we could find those like counties and then do more targeted propaganda and more targeted kind of education, how could that influence overall levels instead of just saying to a largely vaccinated classroom, these are our numbers, this is what we should be afraid of? Because if you look at a recent paper that was just published by the Broad Institute, and I was on this paper and it was really interesting, and we were looking at this outbreak that happened in Provincetown, Massachusetts, of a town that's 90% vaccinated. And if you look at genomic sequencing of that outbreak, where we have a good 50%, 60% of the individuals within the outbreak, we see, oh shit, this is about to be a huge outbreak. It's going to cross the whole country. And now we're doing follow-up research on it. And we said, yeah, we do see transmission between vaccinated individuals. However, their time of infectiousness is shorter. The likelihood of hospitalization is exponentially smaller, as well as this follow-up research that we're doing. We haven't seen those exact genomic sequences and like kind of those strains occurring really anywhere else. And so what would have been an entire outbreak from that, you know, vaccinated individual cluster outbreak hasn't been. And but like you could do a like backwards prediction of like what if they were all unvaccinated. And so this is my gripe. And
no. Look, so you're right. I mean, the big you canvass. I think look. So the big problem for science in getting the truth out there is we can't play quite the same games. We have to tell the story beautifully, and we have to present things in clean ways, and it has to all be defensible. Propaganda is not our thing, right? We can't do that, and we can't say blame game. I know you're using these words here, but I mean we can't do that. We have to say, look, here's really what's happening, and we have to be, it could be that it's some other kind of story, and we have to accept that as well. But I think we understand at this point that we will find, there'll be some numbers we would put on this basic story that it's the unvaccinated who are getting infected, getting sick, taking up all the hospitals. I mean, this is known. Quantifying that and getting a number associated with it.
Like, it's known, and I feel like that's
it's discussed a little bit. Yeah, not very strongly.
Actually, in most academic spaces, we're seeing yes, there's transmission occurring between vaccinated and unvaccinated. Like that's the current space and like the research and in kind of the news. But are we really seeing like it's because of these populations and like putting numbers on that and not saying like the actual blame game? You can't say like it's all your fault, but like why are we not doing that? Like if that's going to takes it to the next level.
Then you have cultural things, right? The US is fundamentally kind of in trouble when it comes to a pandemic because of the individual liberties mindset. It's just in trouble. It's like it will happen again to some extent, and it won't happen in South Korea, unless the cultures change, really dramatically. But as they are now, people are much more willing to say, "I will do my bit to help everyone else." Right? They'll see it as a group thing, and that the stories of like
are unvaccinated 53,000, they aren't seeing that. And so like us continually saying that same story of, oh, we can take on this thing and individual liberties, but if we were to start putting numbers on, if we could, especially this excess number, how much of that individual liberty is really worth how many people's lives? And you started talking about it.
Okay, this is a bigger problem. You have to put the numbers out there, but you can't bring, so the thing I've said in the past, like never bring statistics to a story fight. Right? It's just not going to work out for you, right? And so you can bring them, but you need to bring stories as well. And they need to be good, real stories, right? And I think one of the great disservices, is a great tragedy of this time, is that what's happening in hospitals cannot be broadcasted. So Vietnam, the videos and people were there, and this was a problem for the U.S. military, and was that terrible things were being shown into homes in the U.S. You don't see it. We're not seeing we're getting reports. People will write some things about how difficult it's been for them as a healthcare person. There are some people saying, yeah, social media got me, blah, blah, blah. So it's a really difficult time. But certainly there are many Americans who have a great sense of greater good, 100%. There's no problem for them to think this is not really about me, it's about everyone else. I'm protecting my grandparents, and so and that's a natural thing. It's just it's a big country, and there's a really strong portion of people who really go for the individual liberties. And there's also a fraction of people, it's a big portion of people who are worried that this is going to fundamentally hurt them. I mean, not just conspiracy theory type stuff, but because historically that has been the case for some subpopulations. So
I'm curious to hear why we couldn't bring statistics to the story fight, though, because statistics are what write the story, right? And so if we're talking about protecting these individual liberties, but we aren't able to hear the story about what's happening to healthcare.
People don't think about numbers like this. They don't. So if you just have one individual who dies in some way, and even if it's 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million, 1 in 100 million, that being told to people, and this is studied. I mean, so scientifically, this is studied, which is problematic, right? Because we kind of also do understand it to some extent, but it's hard for us to kind of deal with it. People don't see that as a low probability event. They see it now as something that could really happen, and it moves into a different kind of sphere of possibility. People's notion of risk is everywhere. And there is a big divider with risk on whether you have control or not, whether people perceive. So people are much more afraid of flying than driving. But because you're not, generally you're not in control of a plane, and it's more dramatic, and it's, So that's a risk, and we've sort of talked about risk a bit through this course. Risk is a hugely difficult thing for people to conceive of.
Education out there on that level of risk, in terms of yes, we can't put into numbers, not everyone responds to numbers, but when we talk about educating the class and we bring these charts up in the beginning of class and stuff, do you think we have enough education out there for the individuals that aren't going
to but no, you have to have the numbers as well. But I think if you look in politics, someone who did this well and is a problematic character in history, I suppose, but it's Bill Clinton, who just could talk in this folksy way, then throw in some numbers, whether those numbers were true or not, because it's politics, right? They're sort of whatever. But it's a kind of a difficult, it's an impressive skill set to have. I remember years ago, and I do want to get on with the lecture, but years ago, we're on a ferry to Nantucket of all places, and this is when Lyme disease was taking off and being thought of as, understood to be something that was spreading around the Northeast. And it was particularly bad on Nantucket. But there was a whole hour and a half sort of show by it's juggling ping pong balls and all sorts of stuff. It was very funny. It was very comedic. The numbers went through. So that delivery with either comedy or story wrapped around something, which helps a lot. Big Bird getting vaccinated recently is helpful for people. Of course, there's a sort of pushback on that, and it's sort of blah blah blah. But it's helpful. It's really helpful. But of course, at the core of it, you have to have the truth, right? That this is, here's how many people, blah blah blah. Here's some numbers, blah, blah, blah. So it's that packaging is a big deal. But at the core of it has to be true. And this is the difficult thing to measure. And I just to sort of say one more thing, and we'll talk about it a little bit more as we go along. Is the sortativity, and I guess I mentioned in class maybe on Tuesday, I can't remember, but is an enormous feature of humans, right? So and kind of organisms in general, but the unvaccinated are going to be more likely to be interacting with unvaccinated. I think that's fair to say, because it is sort of regional. But I don't know what those numbers are exactly. But that also is that's why it's much going to be much worse, right? So there's a core of people who are unvaccinated, and they are more likely to be connected to each other. So it's going to spread. And the numbers have stabilized in the US, right? They were dropping for a while, but now they're sort of flat. They're not going down anymore. Certainly a place like Russia, they're going through the roof. And of course, we're just about to hit Thanksgiving. And last year, this was a low point last year. It took off completely, almost, I'm not going to say predictably because we'll talk about it, but basically you're introducing a random mixing, some degree of mixing again, and we'll get it again probably at Christmas. Now, if a lot of people start getting sick again, then people do retreat, right? They just do retreat, mandates or whatever, or just, if you see a lot of people getting sick around you, you hear stories, much more anecdotally, then people will also, take it upon themselves to, and that's very much what happened at the start of the thing. People, the world was hot lava. People were wearing gloves everywhere, washing everything.
To summarize though, do you think it'd be possible to obviously you couldn't publish it in the best journals or anything, but do you think it'd be possible to play that data blame game without you wouldn't want to play it and you'd want to play it right, and maybe you wouldn't even put it anywhere, but do you think you could put
you
enough
want to quantify it? I don't think you'd do it like that. You want to quantify it and say, look, this is, I mean, it's a difficult forensic thing to do, but if you could get out, we're down to, we have 70% are vaccinated, 30% are like this. They're mixing at this kind of rate roughly. That actually makes it more dangerous for that small group because you're basically putting all the tinder together. If you think of the forest fire analogy, right? You're putting all the, so imagine you have this forest, it's got some trees that will burn because they're dry. Okay, so somewhat predicted, but now you rearrange the forest, so now that tinderbox is all together. So there are less people overall that could.
We're thinking about into what impact those individuals would have then. You talk about putting the tinder all in one pile, but how big would the fire be, and how big is that tinder pile contributing to the overall fire is more what I'm trying to think about.
Well, I mean, I think, it depends on the success of our vaccines and, at any given point in history now, and of course we had zero up until, 50 years ago. It's possible you could have a magic vaccine for something that just, you don't even get sick, right? It's a total zero. And there's a Pfizer pill now that might be helpful as well. So it could be that it's really hermetically sealed off, right? Once you have the vaccine, you are not going to get this thing. There's definitely some, we understand in this right now that yes, if you're vaccinated, you can still get sick. Some of those people will die. Percentages are much smaller. I've seen numbers 40 to
very, very small, very, very, very small.
But again, one of those stories getting inflated too much, it's oh, the vaccines don't work. Right?
Right.
It's yeah.
Which so why you would want to play the game of trying to figure out okay, what's the true percentages of things happening and these numbers that we're seeing,
And you have to present it with stories. You have to present it, with beautiful visualizations. Kermit the Frog has to tell you about it. Dolly Parton has to tell you about it. You have to do it well, and you have to be serious and earnest. And people will still say, it's right. There's a huge defense mechanism that's been set up. Here's the thing: these kind of story verses that people live in have defense mechanisms built into them, right? So it doesn't matter what you say, as a scientist or a mainstream media person. The fact that you say anything means that it's probably not true. It gets cherry picked, right? So the New York Times has been delegitimized. I mean, it's problematic in a lot of ways, but it's been delegitimized such that you can now say they're always wrong. Oh, but they got this one right, and still kind of say, oh, look, even the New York Times said the right thing, and still get the benefit of its how well it's regarded in general. So. It's extremely perilous to have people who are trying to be truth tellers, and even that, me saying that sounds probably be easily defeated by someone who's against all of this. But scientists, journalists, in particular, actually are really trying to say this is what happened, this is what will happen, this is what happened in the past, all these sorts of things. And my advisor just had a piece my PhD advisor, Dan Rothman, just had a piece in The Guardian, which I recommend you look at. I tweeted it from the Pox account. And because he's done a lot of work on the giant extinctions of the past, right? So whether we get to a sixth or seventh one, I think the seventh one. he does actually mention stories and narratives. It's interesting because I've talked with him over the years, and he's come to that view as well. Like he tries to present his talks like stories, right? So it's a good attempt to do that. But of course, underneath it, you have to say things about carbon cycles and so on, and then you potentially have lost people. But we just look scientific. Just it is a for a functioning society. We have to have fantastic education. I mean, the bedrock you have to have public education. You have to look at help people, and that just all those. I mean, there are many things that are at play here, but you have to build all of that up and that's been that's been eroded. It's been eroded, and of course, if you have a particular if science kind of hurts your big story, then you will attack it, right? I don't want to I'll sort of steer away from that a little bit, I suppose, but I think the numbers are the problem is what I would call the mismeasurement of complexity and what is a dismeasurement, malmeasurement, mismeasurement of death. That's been a really hard thing for us, and we don't measure death very well.
We don't measure death very well, and that's why I don't want to keep going this. I don't want to keep taking over the class. But with this measurement of death, any prediction you could make about how much each of those individuals might be contributing to the number of excess deaths would be an underestimate, because we are underestimating the number of deaths in this scenario. And so anything you could say anything would be an underestimate of what the true impact might.
Oh, and you handle that well. Like you handle that well. When I say mismeasurement of death, I mean basic overall death, excess deaths, or just number of deaths. We eventually get there in most countries, but it's like 6-7 weeks late, right? There's a lag. So just deaths, which is what we needed immediately. We needed to know how many people are dying basically every hour when the pandemic took off. If you had that, which is what I call the grim scorekeeper, right? It is we need a grim scorekeeper. It's a terrible business, but measuring that in real time by proxy or something would have showed us, what was happening in New York City. Of course, we never knew, and we've never really known in China, right? That we needed to know that number there. And you would just have a different reaction. I mean, you would just have a different reaction. I mean, so we can't even now cast number of deaths, right? And but I think with historic, maybe we're talking about what happened 6 weeks ago, blah blah blah. You could get it. I mean, if you're trying to get statistics together for how many people, unvaccinated people, it's hard. I think it's going to be too slow, and I think I call this story versus the virus. A lot of people will die because they thought the vaccine was some government thing, and have died because they thought the virus was just a flu. I mean, it still keeps happening.
Right. And on that note, do you think any of us are doing enough in that case? Like, we all agree that there's going to be like a lot of death and like, grim, sad, like obviously, all of that kind of jazz. So like, why would there not be more education going around, like scientific data supporting, there's some going into like, yes, this vaccine is like good. And like the Broad Institute puts a lot of stuff out for that. But like individually in like class-based settings and like education at a school-based setting, like what that impacts. Because like, I don't know, in Vermont, there's a large amount of people that are vaccinated, and like finding someone that's unvaccinated is harder to do. But like in other states, that's not the case at all. And so like, I feel like it should start at a university setting. And I feel like that isn't occurring as much, as we talk about that education and why it's so important,
I mean, I think you have to think about what are the most powerful outlets, right? What are the places? And, if you want to do this really well, I mean, I think there are, the government is trying to do what it can, right? Different levels of the state government, they're doing these sorts of things. You would really hope to get religions, churches, that would help. I mean, if you really wanted to have outreach, right? But that, so the US is going to have this kind of funny mixed response. And it did, where the US really prevailed well was in the vaccination early on. And it was a mixture of things. I got my shots at CVS. That's not going to happen probably well, maybe it would. in some other countries, but it just sort of was this big mixture. You know, my children got them from the Army Reserves. You know, were involved, right? That was well done. It sort of used this kind of distributed possibilities. You know, well. So, look, there are great benefits, and I keep thinking about this, to balkanization, right? Where you have some separation of things. And the US is built on that. The states are built with this idea of being a loose federation, as John Stewart called it, the meth labs of democracy, which has a lot of benefits. But when you have to unify against a single enemy and realize that that's the case, then that's been harder for the US. It worked. It was basically, you know, possible in something like the Second World War, right? But even then, it took a couple of years. This is an alien invasion. You know, that's what this is, and we don't really perceive it that way properly.
Right. And we talk about the alien invasion being like the actual virus, but now it's less the virus and more the people that are not handling the virus as well. But we aren't really shaping the story to be in that way anymore. It's like the virus, the virus, the virus. When we do have things that can help prevent the spread, and help people not die as much and help people get back to a normal life, but it's still the virus, the virus, the virus, instead of it being how can we educate those around us that are unvaccinated, because those are now the aliens. Like and I don't want to play the you versus us game, but it's like that's the game we're playing now. It's not the virus versus us. It's like those individuals making the curve, and like that's what you'd want to show statistically, is like that's who's making the curve, not people not knowing about the virus and not taking standards when there was no standards. Now it's a whole different game.
Yeah. Well, so again, there are people in different categories. There are some who historically have, you know, for their group, they have reasons for being, you know, averse to this sort of thing. So you have to have, and that is to say, and then some who are just, you know, straight up conspiracy theory situation. So you have to have a, I mean, it's like anything that goes wrong. You'd have to have a whole panel of ways of dealing with this, right? So I think more and more we need to learn from the people who get people out of cults, right? Like, how do you, because many of, and there's sort of a loose analogy, I don't know if many know about this, but, you know, if someone's depressed, right, there's a list of things you shouldn't say to them, right? That's sort of there's a sort of standardized list. Don't talk to them about, you know, how their parents might feel, or their brothers or sisters, or their children, you know, these kinds of things. And and those lists exist because they're actually all the natural things that people say, and they're kind of very good intentions, but they make it worse. And one thing I think about with a lot of the conspiracy theory stuff, and just, you know, big story, what I'll call story verses in general, is that by the fact that they have evolved and become large, they have been tested against other stories the whole way. And they don't just have defenses, they have ratchets built into them. So they're waiting. So people who've kind of bought into these stories, they've heard all these things about how other people will say X, Y, and Z about them, right? Because it's all been experienced. So they're like, so as soon as that happens, you know, like you're a conspiracy theorist. As soon as that happens, that actually, you're like, oh yeah, they told me they would say this. And that actually not just helps you deflect that, but actually reinforces the truth of what you think is, you know, what you think is true. So that, you know, this is incredibly difficult. That part is really difficult. How do you get someone who really thinks, I mean, there's the microchip stuff, but there's also just, you know, some people who think, well, you know, even just taking vaccine, being forced to do something, even if it's good for you, is bad, right? How do you cope with those different things?
Right. I feel like one group is going to be immediately more accessible than the other group. Like the group that's like more conspiracy instead of like personal liberty is going to be a whole different route than like either of them. So you'd have to like dissect the whole population into like what you could approach with different, you know, terminology and story. But I'm just like surprised in the general kind of landscape of things that that's not more of an approach that's occurring currently. You know,
I think the defense system, if you like, for somewhere like the United States in terms of stories, is lagging incredibly and has been absolutely crushed in the last 10 years because of social media and and to some extent local news that's been correlated with each other. that it's just been incredibly easy. Actually, the people who are doing disinformation, their biggest problem is not the truth, is other disinformation people, right? You're competing against other disinformation. Like, whose story is going to take off? Truth is there, whatever, whatever that is. It's usually not very, not a good story in itself. But I think that's, and you're able to just reach so many people. Obviously, a lot of people do that in very poor ways. It bounces off. It's like a stupid story. It doesn't go very far. That's a very, we know this, and I've talked about this a lot in this class, right? There's a skewed distribution for everything. So and it's true of cults as well. There are lots of tiny little cults where there's basically just one person believes in one other person. There are all these little small scale ones that never blossom. Actually, Terry Pratchett has one of his sort of standalone books in the disc world is called Small Gods, which I would encourage you to read, actually. It's kind of like Life of Brian in terms of its importance of a sort of comedic treatise on religion. But yeah, there are all these little tiny things that never kind of take off, and then some that get a little bit further, blah, 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 and then the ones that get really, really strong. So I think, for a while there, we seem to be fighting disinformation with Snopes, sort of like a website where people would, which just seemed really not even close, and I mean, and you can go back historically in the 80s when AIDS was there was what is now understood, I think, to be a Russian disinformation campaign to make it look like it was created in a US lab, which is still a conspiracy theory that's kind of believed today. Very cleverly was seeded, as we seem to understand it, around the world in English-speaking newspapers, sort of at the edge of, say, India or Thailand, like sort of very fringe things, and they slowly crept in. And eventually Dan Rather talked about it on CBS as this, was HIV created. And the story with that was, that there was a small task force, apparently, organized under the Reagan administration to address it. It was like 4 people. I mean, this is just, it's not even close, right? So, the war front is people's minds, right? It's not the edge of the country or airspace. It's people's minds.
Right. And so when we discuss like how to kind of infiltrate that kind of narrative, do you think there's room for science in that narrative, or is it just the way that you speak? Like, is it just terminology, or could you input some science into
it? So matters tremendously. Infiltrate, even that word, right? So these kinds of, it's really difficult because that word would be a huge trigger to someone else, right? Who thinks the big science is coming for them, and there's a cabal, and somehow Hillary Clinton, whatever, all these things.
The words that would be triggering with the scientific blame game being how I started this. So
yeah. And I just want to, I mean, I understand your point of view totally fine. I mean, I totally get it, but I just want to sort of indicate that would just like, oh, the big bad scientists are coming for us. No, our battle, our absolute eternal battle as in science and in, I would say also, journalism, because I think journalism is just science with a tight deadline, is that we have to, produce, faithfully get the truth out there, and we get to somehow figure out not just sort of, how things happen, but like the mechanics, what's the mechanism, right? We've tried to, so, and just in the context of coronavirus, like, it's unbelievable what we understand now compared to, 100 years ago. Like we know about, the genome. So this is unbelievable information. And the idea that you could, what I wish we could have, of course, right, is everyone who gets tested for COVID, you actually get the genome, like you'd have all of the data on that, which is a really weird piece of information to have, because you could then reconstruct potentially the tree of infection, which we can sort of roughly do. But what I mean is like a billion things. What's that?
Right. And like with that, you can fully retrace like who was kind of in contact with who. And that's exactly what they did in Provincetown to see that outbreak was not as big as it was expected to be. That's exactly what they did.
Presumably we can do it one day at the large scale. Like every little swab test will sort of automatically have all of that and it will be done, right? But you go back 100 years, these concepts are just zero, right? There's just no, like that's total science fiction that you would be able to do contract tracing in a sense, roughly through which is really wild. I mean, that's a really, yeah. I mean, it's sort of similar to, finding murders through genetic trees, right? Which has been this controversial thing. It's a super weird thing that you could basically pinpoint based on DNA, which of course people thought was not, you were worried about fingerprints at some point because of Sherlock Holmes, so you'd wear gloves if you're a bad guy. And then DNA, which just like no one ever, who would think that you were leaving some sort of shadow of yourself? So that's kind of and obviously has peril associated with it in terms of finding there's all of the terrible things that could happen in a eugenics direction. So you have to be very careful. But and I'm not sure humans will be, but the good that good aspect of it, capturing something that's bad or tracing something that's bad, is unbelievable. So no, look, the exhortation I would make is that it's really hard. We have to tell we have to figure out what the truth is, tell the truth. And I kind of, I have this idea, and I'm not saying I'm good at this, but I mean, I have the basic conception of you have to try and tell it at all scales. You have to figure out a soundbite kind of version of it. I mean, we've kind of got like the jab or something. I think they've had some good stuff in New Zealand, which sort of funny little kind of jokey things. They have some issues there with people getting vaccinated as well. Like which, and of course we can also look at which countries have done well in terms of like, there's the cultural part, but maybe they've made some good ad campaigns that you could use from even the UK or Croatia or wherever, right? I mean, we have all of these experiments going along, and that was clear early on that we'd end up with Sweden was going to be an experiment by itself, at least for the Nordic countries. And the states are going to be their own experiments, which in principle, again, is a good idea for just like general like creativity and exploring how to run things. But it is a bad situation when you're up against a universal enemy.
Right, and when we talk about trying to find subgroups, we have Vermont right here as like an isolated subgroup that's, not isolated, but relatively different from many of the other states and can be looked at
behaving differently,
relating to it, and behavioral differences, and counties that are explicitly, as I kind of mentioned that statistic earlier, like potentially responsible for things that you could potentially say some people are responsible for, as like a subgroup to analyze. So I think there's like a lot of potential there. So I don't know. I
don't disagree. You just have to do it well, and then I don't disagree. I mean, I think Vermont, like say South Korea, did well early on, and then you just have this huge problem of the ambient countries around you. New Zealand has cut itself off completely. How long can you hold out? And can you get the vaccine, given that it came into existence, which wasn't guaranteed, right? Wasn't guaranteed, but in that kind of speed up of technology scaling story, Moore's law, it fits, I think. Could you get to a point where you're actually, and I think South Korea looks like they've done very well, but somewhere like Vietnam, very low early on, but finally started to get in, because there's this, you're the good actors, right? Maybe you're a good household, you're a good state, you're a good country, and by good I mean people are behaving sensibly and carefully and so on. You're of course damaging your economy potentially, right? I mean, this is really, really a fraught thing. But eventually, if everyone else has turned into a zombie, it's pretty hard to keep them out. Do you want me to talk about this stuff?
I think it's super interesting, but I feel like I've kind of taken over this course for the last 40 minutes. But if anyone else is interested to discuss this has been ruminating on several brain trains for me, and would happy to like make a small group chat to discuss it. Okay. And maybe like meet up. Peter, you're welcome to have thoughts as well on that, because I just heard you were trying to say something just now.
Well, no, that's fantastic, and you should do it. I mean, I will. I mean, I'll go through this on Tuesday as well, and we'll talk about social contagion, which sits on top of all of this, and then stories. I'll get through as much as I can the rest of the course. But In some ways, I mean, I think it speaks to what you're saying. I mean, it's been really, really incredibly frustrating to watch all of this unfold. I mean, I cannot, nothing that's happened has been in detail really surprising, unfortunately. Like,
Right.
it's just,
On that frustration note, like when we start and looking at all these graphs and start looking at this and having these discussions, like it just builds frustration and like finding like, I don't know, it's not always like remediating frustration by finding someone to blame, but I think understanding more like the roots of what's happening and like, is it really widespread efforts that need to be had now of like, social distancing and making sure we have proper airflow, or is it more about education of others? And that needs to be
you need both. The infrastructure has to be good, right? I mean, you
but
want
like
to make
we're
things.
definitely having more one than the other currently, 100%. In my perspective, 100% more one than the other. And at what level is what we need both? Like, is it going to be another lockdown? Is that actually going to provide any more education? Or are we going to be in this constant cycle?
Well, there's also just as time goes along, I think, and I don't know exactly the Vermont decisions, but what's behind them. But I will say that early on we did connect them with the best, what I think is the best modeling group in the world, Vespignani at Northeastern, who comes out of complex systems and complex networks. I'll mention him in as I have for since 2007 or something or six. I'll mention him in this course. In these slides here. But again, just a very detailed, earnest effort to measure everything and step away from simple kind of models and so on. And his forecasting, or his group's forecasting was good, right? I mean, it was based on mobility and all this sort of stuff. And their early estimates were like between 30 and 3,000 deaths in Vermont. I think if you do it logarithmically, we're a little bit over halfway between those two numbers, right? So 300 would be halfway logarithmically. So by those early estimates, we've done okay. But his just the other problem is like the modeling in general. Okay, let me say this: mathematical epidemiology has been absolutely garbage. It is terrible, and I'll show you this work that we did in 2003 or 4. It was fine early on with all these kinds of models because of course we didn't have data, but it's been shocking to sort of see how that's kind of I mean, it was understandable in the early 2000s. It was still not very good. Data was still kind of being we still hadn't really moved to a big kind of data world for social phenomena. We obviously there are still great limitations in that respect, but we know we're with cell phones and so on, you have a lot more data on how people move around these days. But the sort of stuff that got used at the highest levels, like the terrible stuff from University of Washington. I mean, just to say what that was, I don't know if I have it in my slides probably, but it's the FAR model from the 1800s, which was a normal distribution shape, and that's how diseases would run, which is, I just don't even know what to say. I mean, e to the minus x squared, you guys derived it from random walks. It's one of the most beautiful things that we've ever figured out, basically, central limit theorem. It is indescribably silly because there's no mechanism for like, what's the growth mechanism that's making it crawl up and down like this? It just doesn't make sense. So, it was staggering to see that being used. And of course it was the White House, but that was the one. One of the big problems over and over and over, I'll point to it here, but I just want to really say it strongly, is like all of these models really don't even did not take in what was the overall size of the population. It was just like 0 to 1, right? And 1 is, so after the fact, they are fitted to the extent that it spread, right? So it spread, we'll have Iceland, maybe a continent, maybe the world. None of them are predictive. And that was a huge issue after SARS. So SARS is 2001 or 2. And in fact, our group at Columbia, people reached out, journalists like, well, how big is the next one going to be? And it turned out no one had ever really figured that out, had really ever addressed it, which is pretty astonishing and not what you would do with other natural disasters. I'm going to talk, if that's all right. This is great. I mean, it's fantastic. And I'm happy to, I mean, here we are, right? I mean, I'm at home sick. I'm better now, I suppose. But, I thought that was at least timely. Okay, yeah. Yeah, there's my community reference. And I may have some clips from it's season 2, episode 7, I think. It's called Epidemiology. It's really great. And this is part of the story. We have had pandemics forever, and they are built into our stories. We are. I don't think ring around. That. I don't think that's right. I think that's a misconnection. People do think that ring whatever it is, or rosy wheel fall down. I think that's not right. But so that's something that's maybe reinterpreted as being about diseases, but. We don't have great data on diseases going back into the, thousands of years ago. We have stories about it, recordings, but we don't really know the numbers. And that's what this is, right? So this is, let's see where we are now. This is an old piece from Wikipedia, but you can see this kind of messiness, maybe 30% of the population, 40% of the population. These are giant numbers. I think we might see some countries get to 1%. I think Russia might get to 1%. We'll see. But that's a giant number. It's a giant number. There's this Robin Dunbar's number for people is the sort of this idea of cognitive carrying capacity for how many people you might know reasonably well, and that's 150, right? So it's this anthropological work, and it's been done for animals and so on. And there are all these other kind of older estimates of how many friends you have, right? So and how many close friends. They're usually on the order of hundreds. There was one from 20 years ago before all Facebook stuff. It's like 291 is the average number of friends that Americans have. I think it was like that, 291. Anyway,
Peter,
but the point is, once you get to one sorry.
In order to get to that 1% figure, when are you anticipating capping the end of this pandemic? Because I think we would get to more than 1%, it would be to have it not actually really end for a decade.
I mean, I guess I was thinking that, we'll see what happens to them in the winter, basically. But it's pretty rampant there now. And I think it's now at 1 in 160. And again, that's based on numbers. We have to, is Russia really reporting actual total deaths? Well, I think it's certainly not reporting COVID deaths well. This is by death toll, right? So these are giant numbers. I mean, see, this is how little we know, 17 to 54%. I mean, it's just horrific numbers. And of course, as I said, we've had any number of stories. There's a 12 Monkeys, the movie, and then there was a TV show based on that, which involves time travel, but it's something where almost everyone dies. There are many kind of popular stories where we really get into the I'm trying to talk about. And I guess I'm trying to bring that up because these are things traditionally that until only recently we had, and as we have discussed somewhat at length, we still are very confused about, but we literally had no idea where these things came from, right? And we kind of made up all sorts of stories, perhaps, but just you're fine, and then you're horribly, then you're terrible things. And Ebola, of course, is one of the more dramatic ones. These are dates, right? So this is, we don't really. This is not right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. These are the major ones. So there's COVID-19, which is to present, but this will run out. I mean, to Catherine's point, there will be something of an endpoint here. And if you look through the list of all of them, there's a much longer list. There's just any number of smaller scale kinds of ones. The only one that sticks out like this is, and really it's kind of 1950, I suppose, but globally, as a pandemic, it's 1980s on, is HIV. right? I mean, I think people sort of forget about this, but it is. Okay, so COVID, actually, it's interesting, at least on Wikipedia, they've put this estimate up to 20 million, that's the economist upper limit, is 20 million deaths now, based on worldwide ones. So it's good to see that that's there. So this is pretty considerable. The 1918 flu pandemic, which I think really this just should not be called this. Again, huge variation. We just don't really know, but up to 100 million people. And of course, that's a much smaller population. I think that this is a global population lost 1 to 5%. So this is less, but a 1/4%. That's a gigantic number. I can't believe we're living in this. So in terms of percentage lost, I don't know how well that orders itself, but yeah, Black Death, we just don't know. This is a long time ago, and the numbers are just. Right. So all of this is to say we have this kind of historical record. We have similar things for volcanoes. Meteor strikes are more complicated, but that's sort of these. These things that can happen to us, tsunamis, right? We have no control. But it's more complicated, much more complicated with epidemics because obviously it's entrained with social behavior, as we've talked about, and that becomes an enormous part of it. Quarantine, the original meaning of that, I think, comes from, and maybe is it 4 weeks? I think. And it means like how long you should be separated from everyone else. So confusion of contagions, right? So it's this is again a thing to be careful with in terms of language, or just to think about what people are saying for metaphors. Was Harry Potter a virus, right? What was going on there? It certainly wasn't a good virus to start with. I'll talk about that later on. It took 12 or 13 editors to decide it could be a global virus. We use these terms all the time. What about all these other things? And there's been work in the last 20 years that starts to suggest, and we'll talk about this in social contagion, that some of these things spread. And I'm going to push back on it, but a tendency to sort of measure them as, or see these things as spreading like diseases, and then seeing diseases as spreading like, say, wildfire. Right, that's sort of the go-to one. Lots of other things. Do these things spread? Religion. Religion can spread sort of organically, and of course we, straight up have missionary type activity. Democracy. Does it spread? This is a contention of sort of a line in The Information by James Gleick or Gluck. That the alphabet was contagious. It was invented in the Middle East and then went and spread everywhere. I don't know if we have a linguist who wants to tell me what the truth is there, but yeah. Stories. A story is contagious. Okay, shaking it off. So there are lots of different kinds of contagions, and I know I've said this in class, but I guess I should say it again. I've sort of got a bad set of slides that I tried to build around COVID-19. And I know I've probably said this, but I think I want to put it in here. So it's a conspiracy, right? It's not a contagion. It's to touch, and I'll repeat that again. But that was a good understanding of disease spreading, right? We're just going to put it straight in there, give it a fancy name to make it sound like we know what we're doing, which is like one of my favorite words is idiopathic, right? Which some of you will know about, which just means it's a medical way of saying we don't know what the cause is. But it sounds like you do because you call it idiopathic instead of like, I don't know. But conspiracy is with breath, right? So, and this is shocking, right? It's May 2021 when WHO declared that it could be transmitted by air, through air, rather than droplets or licking each other or something like that, which were the considered things we had to worry about. And so, surfaces, we're very worried about that early on. There was a lot of hand cleaning. And I think the CDC maybe a month later. So, yeah. Anyway, so it is a conspiracy, is what I'm saying. It is a conspiracy. In terms of communicating with the public, to Bryn's point, that is not going to help. So we should keep that in a box. Maybe John Stewart could do it well. So natural morphisms, right? Where we, these are metaphorical lifts. The feeling was contagious. News spread like wildfire. Freedom is the most contagious virus known to man. There's a little bit of rhetoric. Maybe not. Coleridge, nothing is so contagious as enthusiasm. Ambrose Bierce, who disappeared mysteriously. The doctrine that everything is beautiful, including what is ugly, everything good, especially the bad, and everything right that is wrong. It is hereditary, but fortunately not contagious. That's the Devil's Dictionary. Which I don't know if people know about that anymore, but it's a quirky construction of snarky definitions for things from the 1800s. Anyway, this is used. It's used a lot. So I'm just going to give you a few sort of other things. Hoffa. You know this guy? Eric Hoffa. He's a stevedore, a dock worker in San Francisco, and became quite famous for writing these books of aphorisms and that were after the Second World War, as the Cold War was growing. So it was against totalitarianism. But this is his little observations, right? I'm not saying they're right, but you'll see his little aphorisms have been used a lot, and I'll give you some examples. But right, so there is a grandeur in the uniformity of the mass, right? When a fashion, a dance, a song, a slogan, or a joke, this is again in the 1950s, sweeps like wildfire from one end of the continent to the other. 100 million people roar with laughter, sway their bodies in unison. It is true in the 50s, of course, that TV was, now something that could reach many people, but they weren't on social media talking about it. Hum one song or break forth in anger and denunciation. There's an overpowering feeling that in this country we've come nearer the brotherhood of man than ever before. So, he was not taking all this, he's not talking about this in all these just positive ways. Obviously, there's an incredible dark side to this uniformity of human behavior. So the true believer is his main work, perhaps, that he's remembered for. We can be absolutely certain only about things we do not understand. Mass movements can rise and spread without belief in God, but never without belief in a devil. Which is not, okay, yeah. Not every, major religion has a hell, of course, but that's a different thing. This is there is a us versus them situation, and then them is evil. It's very, very well done. But hell, I guess, is a bit different. Hell is loss aversion. It's a good understanding of human behavior. And Bryn, maybe.
There's a double entendre, though. He also means like as Hitler is the devil, and people actually believing in somebody that is a devil. So it's got a two-layered meaning.
Yeah. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I think of course, the first one is all you need for it to really work, right? So, yeah, it's funny because there is a story laid out of the Antichrist, right? Which is just sort of waiting. Again, like a story defense mechanism structure. Obama was the Antichrist, blah blah blah. Like it's sort of waiting to be wrapped around someone that you don't like. How it never got wrapped around Trump, I think, is a real achievement of because he sort of ticks a lot of boxes, so to speak. So where freedom is real, equality is the passion of the masses, and where equality is real, freedom is the passion of a small minority. Again, not saying all these things are true, but he had those little turns of phrase that people could pick up and put on, posters there's the success posters, right? But then there's a whole series of despair. I don't know if despair.com is still around, but the opposite, the demotivation ones. Right. When people are free to do as they please, they usually imitate each other, which is an interesting conjecture, right? I mean, this, and to sort of put it in the context of complex systems, right? This is an interaction rule, right? A little behavioral rule that you can kind of put into a little model of how people behave. Yeah, it's like tit for tat or the golden rule, etc., etc. Poor old zebras. Anyway, never underestimate the power of stupid people in large groups. This is that's an important one. Okay, which is with a fantastic. Oh my god. Okay, sorry. Let's see if this works. So this is how diseases spread early on. The new stores are going to be red. Existing stores, I mentioned it the other day. So this is Walmart spreading in the US. Took a long time. There's a few popped up in Vermont eventually. Of course, it matches pretty well where people live. We'll do it once more because it's fun. Right, very small. Arkansas is in the dates, the years up here as well. Really starts to take off. But this is a trucking thing, so kind of need, right? There's a real geographical limit. And when you look, to the extent that we have data on diseases from thousands of years ago, or the kind of time span, they spread more like waves, right, across continents. And we've already talked about the small world network stuff. That was a good, again, just a toy model. No mechanism gives rise to it, but kind of encapsulated this issue of local ties and random ties. Of course, there are ties at all scales, and that's what we'll have later on. But people moving around the world spreading diseases is a completely different game now with flights. This is the US mobilization. Anyone know what this is? Two 2001. What do I mean by mobilization?
Is it obesity?
Yes. Yeah. Mobilized meat. So I'm a terrible person, but it's Colorado sort of hung on for the longest, I suppose. It's always sort of been its virtuous character. But okay, does obesity spread contagiously? Right. So there's a huge paper about 10 or 12 years ago that suggests that. We'll look at it. Very contentious, and of course the claim was that it does, and it's your friends. It's from your friends. It's not from family. So if your friends get bigger, become heavier, then you will become heavier. That was the big claim. It was published in, I think, British Medical Journal, BMJ. So not quite the Lancet and the measles vaccine causing autism sort of level, perhaps, but big enough. And of course, the natural story that people started to kind of tell was like, you should break off your relationships with your larger friends. Science obviously matters, right? So that turns out not to be the case. I should be very clear, but we'll look at it. But it turns out to be a pretty terrible study. Again, this is the story thing, right? So this is zombies, right? Which, I mean, maybe there's some weird little zombie kind of organism things that we try to find them in the real world, but they're a distillation of a contagious disease, and of course we become the army of the bad thing that's spreading. With COVID, we had this alarming kind of emergence of the. So all great pandemics have some terrible features about them, right? They don't all have to be the same, but they'll have some something about them. They've got to be infectious. They've got to take a little while perhaps to incubate, right? So Ebola is, this very famous disease, but because of its awfulness, but it tends to burn out too quickly, right? It's hard for it to spread. It became slightly less deadly, I think, is really what happened. Like, so that's the problem with Ebola. Like, as it moves away from being something that's essentially, kills you almost immediately, then its chance of spreading around the world becomes real. I mean, I just remember a Roz Chast joke kind of cartoon, someone lying awake at night on the Upper West Side and just fretting about things in the world, and one of them was like Ebola in New York City. This was funny, right, in 1998 or something, but then it became real. Anyway, zombies are sort of an encapsulation of a terrible disease. Vampires, you could be a cool person and live forever, so that's kind of good. It's a bit complicated. Werewolves seem to have a good time. Anyway, we tell a lot of stories, right? The Walking Dead has been huge. This is infections where the infection has gone from story infections, right? They went from a comic into a pretty, well, iZombie is a quirky one, which you've probably never seen, but I quite like it. Good value. Good premise here. This is basically a detective kind of situation where by eating the brains of someone, you think like them for a while. So yeah, premise is good. New Zealand actress, actually. Yeah, there you go. Infection of New Zealanders into the world. Okay, so so contagion. So I mentioned again with conspiracy, but it's the spreading of a quantity, right? So in general, but it's also the disease itself. It's a little bit sort of used in different ways. So to be slightly careful there. Contagion, of course, does have unpleasant overtones, and so when you talk about social contagion, maybe it's being a bit too dramatic, and at times I've sort of wondered about that. But I think it's right, actually. I think it's good. I think it's good to have a little bit of, even if we're talking about social contagion of like goodness or something, maybe we're right. So spreading is going to be a neutral word that we could use. Had a conference in 2003 with Murray Gell-Mann, and that's what we called it. Spreading on networks was a good basic thing. Contagion's quite kind of exciting as well, and does connote the badness of things. So we'll talk about two main classes of them, and again, I'm not going to tell you everything about these things, and we're living in a pandemic now, so this will have different kind of resonances. But infectious diseases, and then social contagion, lots of things, right? So fashion, right? Just an enormous number of things, just word usage, right? Language. And from very small, seemingly benign things to really serious, dramatic, massive things.
What about push versus pull? I mean, none of these, this seems to be working on sort of the diffusion model that if it's there, in a certain way, it will spread. But when you're talking about things that are like pushed by publishers, that may be executives in a room in Simon & Schuster deciding to do it that way rather than there being any kind of natural spread. Yeah,
so we'll absolutely deal with that. Yes. So there's what's possible with. Humans could do something bad and create spread something, right? We have stories about that. Maybe it's happened, but put stuff into the world and accentuate a disease. But social contagion, we do it all the time, and I'll have a whole thing about that. Basically, just the reality is socially constructed, and but it is hard to measure how much of that goes on, and we tend to, with stories ourselves, kind of ignore it, or we don't. It doesn't make for such a good story, unless we want to explain how something we don't like took off. We can just say it was luck. So this is a extension of sort of the fundamental attribution error. Like if a thing is successful and we think it's good, it's successful because people made good individual choices. But if it's something we think is garbage, we can just say, well, people are idiots and they follow each other. So it's sort of a funny thing where we kind of do have some understanding of that, process, but we don't realize it's happening all the time.
Well, I mean, a movie budget, you know, publicity budgets are relatively public information, for example.
Yeah. No, I look, that's sitting there. The Metacritic stuff that I've sort of pointed to, Rotten Tomatoes. You can think of how much, who's had the biggest losses, blah blah blah. Like what happened, and for movies, you know, there was an understanding at some point, and I will definitely talk about this kind of more. What happens is basic advertising, right? Like just boom, let's open it, let's talk about it all the time. We'll show you some sort of misleading trailer, and then we'll open it in 4,000 theaters because we've got that much money. Everyone, you know, a lot of people go to see it. The word of mouth, it dies in the word of mouth part, right? It's like maybe Eternals. Eternals obviously had some just gigantic budget. Right now, I think the reviews are bad, and that's going to hurt it, right? It's going to really hurt that whole thing going forward. So I don't know what Aaron Rodgers wearing the Rise of Skywalker hoodie when talking about his. I don't know what that's going to do for that. Anyway, so that's sort of a way to get around it. But of course, what you really want for things to become famous or take off is that it gets out into the social wild away from you, and that's a hard thing to control. Bad things can get into the social. This is what my term, social wild, right? What gets out in there and spreads between average people, and I have a sort of a thesis later on for why, you know, that's the biggest ideal, and some of our older work I think connects into how BuzzFeed was founded, structured. I mean, we have older connections to Jonah Peretti, guy I work with, was good friends with him. I thought a lot about this, and I'll talk about that later on. And Facebook, you know, really got to see this. They got to see not just what people do, but the edges, right? They started to piggyback on the edges, and there's a huge history of them now, of course, trying to get into the social network, which advertisers never had a chance. I mean, it was very hard until the sort of modern era, where you could see, you know, who's connecting with whom and so on. Still very difficult measuring influence. Who influences someone about something? Like, why did you do this thing you did? Why did you buy this product? You know, lots of things kind of come to you about that. That's hard to measure. So it's hard to go back to an advertiser and say, you know, this is why it took off. But more data on that has made it more possible, but also just more able to mess with the social, right? So it's not just this injection to people. You're messing with the connections between people, which from on the disease point of view, you know, you're trying to stop those interactions with people, right? You're trying to do the opposite, right? We're trying to slow it down. So, you know, we have a sense of that as well. But social contagion is really, really complex. Sorry.
We're not hearing the sound, Peter, although I know what happens.
Oh.
I'm not dead yet.
Really? Not hearing the sound? God.
Oh, we didn't see it. We didn't hear the sound.
Why can't you hear the sound? I mean, it's not crucial for everyone's existence, I realize, but that's amazing. Okay, let me just quickly. There's vital things I'm trying to show you.
Yes, that's necessary to everyone's cultural education.
Wow. Yeah, no, of course, right. Output. Wow. Wow. Does anyone have any idea how to do that? Just seems amazing to me. Oh, it's too much. Why is there no, this is not right. Does anyone? Oh, okay. All right. I'll show you those next obviously. Anyway, so yeah, so I guess we're running out of time. Fair enough. And the start of next week would be about this. But next week I'll talk about. Many of you will know the SIR model, so I'll just mention it. But what I want to show you is what happens if you generalize it a little bit to have movement, and how things become absurdly unpredictable. And perhaps let me show you this. Right, this is an old thing. This is prediction. This is an attempt to classify. This is from the CDC, right? So it's modeled on the hurricane scale. You know, to give an idea, but it's really, you know, this is really difficult, really messy. You know, so here's I'll leave you with this. Can we predict the size of an epidemic? Right. So we see. I mean, just to talk about, this is just my frustration. It doesn't really matter, I suppose. But you know, in January of 2020, we started to get images from China. They're building all of these hospital structures, you know, like, and you sort of zoom in and you realize there are these big digger things, and there are like 20 of them, and it's a huge space. That was an unbelievably bad sign. I mean, that was really bad, and I'm just like, no, you know, this is terrible, and we're tweeting madnesses. You know, can you predict the size of something, and how important is this reproduction number, which is this old thing? It comes from a very simple model, which we'll talk about again. As I said on Tuesday. You know, how many people do you expect to infect from one person? And here's sort of a problem, is that R naught's about the same for all of these things. And these, of course, are these numbers we don't really know about. SARS, maybe 1,000 people, maybe it was 10,000. Maybe it was 10,000. It probably wasn't 100,000. But it wasn't millions, and certainly the fraction of the population at the time, it's even much smaller. But these all had about the same kind of infection rates, like, yeah, one person. And what does it even mean? You know, if you're in a lecture room, or if you're in a choir singing with other people, and close to, you know, there was an example, I think, in Washington State, 60 people practicing in a choir for several hours. One person had COVID. By the end of it, or in the next few days or something, almost all of them had it. So, you know, what are we even doing with this R naught thing? And okay, so it's time to go. But just to say over and over again, when you think about human behavior, it's about groups. I know I said it before, but I'm going to say it again. So to that extent, the sociologists have it right, because they put it in their name. It's groupology, right? So, you know, people coming together in groups drives so much of what happens in good and bad ways. And for diseases, certainly this is a bad thing. So it's really fraught for us, right? We do like to come together in groups for all sorts of reasons. We're humans, we like to do it. It helps us. But you know, there are bad things that come through that, like diseases and QAnon, or something like that. Okay, so I know it's time to go. This is both awful and great to talk about, and I appreciate the discussion. All right, we'll be back. I'm sure I don't have COVID, which would be ridiculous if I did, but ironic, I suppose, or something. On Tuesday, we'll be back in the human space, trying to spread the diseases. Okay. Thank you, people. Okay. Oh, extra week for the assignment. It's a mess. Yeah.
Okay. So the assignment is due next Friday then?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Yep. No problem. It's small too. You should see it. Okay. Office hours are next. All right. Okay. Bye.